Abandoned little girls at the bus stop ask for help, unaware they're speaking to a millionaire CEO. Before we dive in, let's light up this comment section with hearts from every corner of the world. The rain hammered against Richard Morrison's BMW as he pulled up to the downtown bus stop that Tuesday evening in July 2024. At 52, the tech CEO had seen enough of life's cruelties, especially after losing his beloved wife Catherine 3 years ago to cancer. But nothing could have prepared him for what he saw through his rain-streaked windshield. Two small figures huddled together on the metal bench, sharing a torn cardboard box as shelter. The older girl, maybe 8 years old, had her arms wrapped protectively around a smaller child who couldn't have been more than 6. Their clothes were soaked through, their hair plastered to their heads, and they were shivering uncontrollably. Richard's first instinct was to drive past. He'd learned to build walls around his heart after Catherine's death. Getting involved meant opening himself up to pain again, and he'd had enough of that to last several lifetimes. But something about the way the older girl held her sister made him think of Catherine, how she used to comfort the children at the pediatric ward where she volunteered. He cursed under his breath and pulled over. The rain was coming down in sheets as he approached them, his expensive suit immediately drenched. Up close, he could see they were both Asian American, with dark hair and eyes that held far too much fear for children their age. The older girl noticed him first and instinctively pulled her sister closer. "Hey there," Richard said softly, crouching down to their level, despite the puddle forming around his Italian leather shoes. "Are you girls okay? Where are your parents?" The older girl's chin trembled, but she tried to look brave. "We're waiting for our mama," she whispered, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. She said she'd be right back. Richard felt his chest tighten. He'd heard enough stories in his 52 years to recognize abandonment when he saw it. "How long have you been waiting, sweetheart?" "Since." The girl looked at the darkening sky, confusion clouding her features. "Since yesterday. Maybe the day before. I don't remember." Her voice broke on the last word, and the smaller girl began to cry softly. Richard's heart shattered completely. These children had been alone for at least 2 days, maybe more. In this weather, in this part of town, anything could have happened to them. Without another thought, he shrugged off his suit jacket and wrapped it around both girls. "I'm Richard," he said gently. "What are your names?" "I'm Emma," the older girl said, still wary but drawn to his warmth. "This is my little sister Lily. She's only 6, and she's scared." "6," Richard repeated, his voice catching. Catherine would have been horrified to know children this young were suffering alone. "Well, Emma, you're being very brave taking care of Lily, but I think you both need somewhere warm and dry right now." Emma's eyes widened with a mixture of hope and terror. "But what if Mama comes back and we're not here?" Richard looked at the empty bus stop, at the rain that showed no signs of stopping, at these 2 beautiful children who'd been abandoned by the one person who should have protected them. His logical mind told him to call child services and walk away. But his heart, the heart that Catherine had always said was too big for his own good, made a different choice. "Tell you what," he said, pulling out his phone. "I'm going to leave a note here with my phone number. So if your mama comes looking, she'll know exactly where to find you. But right now, you both need food and warmth, and I happen to have both." As he helped the girls to their feet, Richard had no idea that this moment would change not just their lives, but his own in ways he couldn't imagine. The rain continued to fall, washing away the old life he'd known and preparing the ground for something entirely new. Richard's penthouse apartment had been a shrine to his life with Catherine for the past 3 years. Her reading glasses still sat on the marble coffee table, her favorite throw blanket draped over the leather sofa, where she used to curl up with her medical journals. He'd kept everything exactly as she'd left it, unable to face the finality of packing away her memory. Now, watching Emma and Lily stand dripping in his pristine entryway, he realized how cold and lifeless the space had become. Their presence, small and vulnerable as it was, somehow breathed life back into rooms that had felt more like a museum than a home. "Wow," Lily whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Seattle skyline. "Are you a prince?" Despite everything, Richard found himself smiling for the first time in months. No, sweetheart, just a businessman who got lucky. He grabbed towels from the guest bathroom and knelt down to help dry their hair. "Let's get you both warm and fed, and then we'll figure out what to do next." Emma remained suspicious, her dark eyes tracking his every movement. "You're not going to hurt us, are you?" "Mama always said not to go with strangers." "Your mama was absolutely right," Richard said, meeting her gaze directly. "You should never go with strangers. But sometimes when someone is in real trouble, good people try to help. I promise you, I only want to make sure you're safe." As he rummaged through his kitchen, a space that had barely been used since Catherine's death, Richard realized he had no idea how to feed children. His refrigerator contained expensive wine, leftover takeout, and not much else. But buried in the back of a cabinet, he found a box of mac and cheese that Catherine had bought for her volunteer work. "I used to help kids like you," he said as he boiled water, remembering Catherine's stories from the hospital. "My wife. She worked with children who were sick or scared. She taught me that sometimes the simplest things, like a warm meal and a safe place to sleep, can make all the difference." While the pasta cooked, he noticed Emma examining a framed photo on the counter. Richard and Catherine on their wedding day 15 years ago. Catherine's radiant smile seemed to light up the kitchen even now. "She's pretty," Emma said softly. "Is she your mama?" "She was my wife," Richard said, his voice catching slightly. "She died 3 years ago, when she was about the same age as your mama probably is now." Emma's expression softened with understanding beyond her years. "Did it make you sad?" "Very sad," Richard admitted. "The saddest I've ever been." "We're sad too," Lily chimed in, climbing onto one of the bar stools. "Mama cried a lot before she left us at the bus stop. She said she couldn't take care of us anymore." Richard's hand stilled on the wooden spoon. "She said that, those exact words." Emma nodded, tears finally spilling over. "She said she wasn't a good mama because we didn't have enough food or money for rent. She said maybe someone better could take care of us." Her voice broke completely. "But we just wanted her. We didn't care about being hungry." Richard felt rage building in his chest, not at these innocent children, but at whatever circumstances had driven a mother to such desperation that she'd abandon her babies. He'd seen enough in the business world to know that people didn't make such choices lightly. There was more to this story, and he intended to find out what. As he served the mac and cheese, watching the girls eat like they hadn't seen food in days, Richard made a decision that would have shocked his business associates. He was going to find their mother. Not to turn her in, not to judge her, but to understand what had driven her to such a desperate act. "Emma, Lily," he said softly, "I want you to know that whatever happens, you're safe now. I'm going to help you find your mama, and we're going to figure this out together." But even as he spoke those words, Richard had no idea that finding Sarah Chen would lead him down a path that would challenge everything he thought he knew about family, sacrifice, and second chances. The girls had been asleep for 2 hours in Catherine's old study, curled up together on the daybed like 2 small angels. Richard had found some of Catherine's old pajamas from medical school, still too big, but warm and clean. Now he sat in his home office, staring at the security footage from the bus stop that his company's cameras had captured. The timestamp showed 6:47 a.m. on Sunday morning, July 14th. A young Asian woman, thin and exhausted-looking, walked up to the bench holding the hands of two small girls. Richard enhanced the image, his heart breaking, as he watched the woman kneel down and speak earnestly to the children. Even without sound, he could see the pain etched on her face. At 6:52 a.m., the woman stood up, kissed both girls, and walked away without looking back. But Richard caught something the children probably missed. The woman collapsed against a building half a block away, her shoulders shaking with sobs, before disappearing around the corner. This wasn't the act of a heartless mother. This was the desperate choice of someone who believed she had no other options. His phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. "Morrison, Richard, it's Detective James Rodriguez. I heard through the grapevine that you might have found some abandoned children." Richard's blood chilled. He'd called the police as soon as they had arrived at his apartment, but he'd hoped for more time before the system intervened. Word travels fast. It does when it involves kids. "Look, I know you mean well, but these children need to go into protective custody while we locate their mother. I can be there in 20 minutes with a social worker." Wait. Richard found himself standing, pacing to the window where he could see the city lights twinkling like stars. "Give me 24 hours. I think I can find their mother." "Richard, you're not equipped to—" "I've got resources you don't have. Security cameras, private investigators, technology, and the girls trust me. If you take them now, they'll be traumatized all over again." He paused, knowing he was about to reveal more than he'd intended. "James, these kids remind me of Catherine. She would have moved heaven and earth to keep them safe and together." The silence stretched for a long moment. 24 hours, Rodriguez finally said. "But if you don't find her, or if there's any sign these children are in danger, I'm bringing them in. And Richard, be careful. Sometimes there are reasons parents abandon their children that have nothing to do with love." After hanging up, Richard returned to the security footage. Using facial recognition software from his company, he began searching through databases, looking for any trace of the woman who'd left Emma and Lily at that bus stop. It took 6 hours, but he found her. Sarah Chen, 28 years old, worked as a registered nurse at Seattle General Hospital. No criminal record, no red flags in her background check. According to employment records, she'd been working double shifts for the past 6 months. Her last known address was an apartment building in the International District, but the landlord's records showed she'd been evicted for non-payment 2 weeks ago. But it was the medical records that made Richard's blood run cold. Sarah Chen had been treated in the emergency room 3 times in the past month for exhaustion and malnutrition, and according to the hospital's financial records, she owed over $40,000 in medical bills, not her medical bills. Bills for someone named Margaret Chen, listed as her mother. Richard printed out everything he could find and headed to his car. It was 4 a.m., but he couldn't wait until morning. Somewhere out there, a young mother was probably walking the streets, believing she'd lost her children forever. And if his research was correct, she wasn't just dealing with poverty, she was dealing with a parent's worst nightmare. As he drove through the empty Seattle streets toward the hospital where Sarah worked, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this story was about to become much more complicated than a simple case of abandonment. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Catherine's voice whispered the words she'd always lived by. Sometimes the people who need help the most are the ones too proud to ask for it. Sarah Chen leaned against the hospital's breakroom wall, her hands shaking as she tried to drink her 3rd cup of coffee in 2 hours. She'd been working for 36 hours straight, picking up every available shift since she'd made the decision that would haunt her forever. 3 days ago, she'd stood at her mother's bedside in the ICU, listening to Dr. Patterson explain that Margaret needed another surgery. The cancer had spread faster than anyone expected, and without immediate intervention, she had maybe weeks to live. The surgery would cost another $25,000, money Sarah simply didn't have. "I can't," she'd whispered to her unconscious mother, holding her frail hand. "I've already lost the apartment, Mama. The girls and I have been sleeping in the car for 2 weeks. I don't know what else to do." That's when the social worker had appeared with papers for Sarah to sign, gently explaining that if she couldn't provide stable housing for Emma and Lily, the state would have to intervene. The choice was simple: surrender the girls voluntarily and know they'd be placed in a good home, or have them taken away and risk them ending up anywhere in the system. Sarah had signed the papers with tears streaming down her face, but when morning came, she couldn't bring herself to take them to the state office. Instead, she'd driven to the bus stop in the business district, the one place where she knew successful, caring people passed by every day. "Someone will see them," she'd told herself as she kissed Emma and Lily goodbye. "Someone with resources and love to give. Someone who can provide what I can't." The memory of Lily's confused face, asking when Mama would be back, had been playing on repeat in Sarah's mind for 3 days. She'd barely slept, barely eaten, surviving only on the hope that her babies were safe and warm somewhere. "Sarah?" Dr. Patterson appeared in the break room doorway. "I've been looking for you. We need to talk about your mother." Sarah's heart stopped. "Is she?" "She's stable, but she's been asking for you and the girls. She doesn't know about—" He paused, studying Sarah's hollow-eyed expression. "She doesn't know about your housing situation, does she?" "I couldn't tell her," Sarah whispered. "She's been fighting so hard to get better, to come home to us. How could I tell her there's no home to come to? How could I tell her I gave away her granddaughters?" Dr. Patterson sat down across from her, his expression gentle but concerned. "Sarah, where are Emma and Lily right now?" Vichy's, the question she'd been dreading for 3 days, finally came, and Sarah felt her carefully constructed composure crumble completely. "I don't know," she sobbed. "I left them somewhere safe, somewhere someone would find them and help them. But I don't know where they are now or if they're okay, and I'm going crazy not knowing." "You left them?" "Sarah, my God, do you realize—" "Do I realize what? That I'm a terrible mother? That I failed them?" Sarah's voice rose, attracting concerned looks from other staff members. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't been replaying every other option in my head for 3 days? I had nothing left. No money, no home, no family except my dying mother. What was I supposed to do? Let them watch me fail to take care of them until the state took them anyway?" Dr. Patterson leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Sarah, listen to me. There are programs, resources we could have explored. Social services, charity organizations, hospital financial aid. I tried all of that." Sarah's composure shattered completely. "I've applied for everything, been on waiting lists for months. Do you know what it's like to watch your children get thinner each day while you're waiting for bureaucracy to maybe help you? Do you know what it's like to see Emma trying to take care of Lily because she thinks Mama can't handle it anymore?" The break room fell silent, except for Sarah's heartbroken sobs. Other nurses and doctors pretended not to listen, but Sarah could feel their judgment, their shock that a colleague could make such a choice. "I need to find them," she whispered. "I need to know they're safe. Even if I can never get them back, I need to know someone is taking care of them." What Sarah didn't know was that at that very moment, a man in an expensive suit was walking through the hospital corridors, asking questions about her. Richard Morrison had been searching for her for hours, and he was about to discover that the story of Emma and Lily's abandonment was far more complex and heartbreaking than he'd ever imagined. Richard found Sarah in the hospital parking garage at 5:30 a.m., sitting on the ground beside a beat-up Honda Civic with expired registration tags. She was staring at her phone, scrolling through photos of Emma and Lily with the hollow expression of someone who'd lost everything that mattered. Sarah Chen. His voice was gentle, but she still jumped like a startled deer. "Who are you?" Her eyes were red-rimmed and suspicious, and Richard could see she was running on nothing but caffeine and desperation. "My name is Richard Morrison. I have your daughters." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She scrambled to her feet, her phone clattering to the concrete. "Are they okay? Please tell me they're okay." "I've been going crazy not knowing—" "They're safe," Richard said quickly, holding up his hands in a peaceful gesture. "They're at my apartment, sleeping. They're fed, they're warm, and they're unharmed. But Sarah, we need to talk." Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank back down to the ground, her relief so overwhelming that she couldn't breathe properly. "Thank God," she whispered over and over. "Thank God, thank God." Richard crouched down beside her, and for the first time since he'd found the girls, he really looked at their mother. Sarah was tiny, maybe 5'2", with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of weeks without proper sleep. Her scrubs hung loose on her frame, and her hands had the telltale tremor of someone who'd been skipping meals. This wasn't a neglectful parent. This was someone who'd been drowning. "Why?" he asked softly. "Help me understand why you left them." Sarah's laugh was bitter and broken. "You wouldn't understand. You found them, which means you have resources, stability. You probably can't imagine what it's like to fail so completely at the one job that matters most." "Try me." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah told him everything. About Margaret's cancer diagnosis 6 months ago, about the mounting medical bills that had eaten through their savings and Sarah's retirement fund, about working double shifts and still falling behind on rent, about the eviction notice and the nights sleeping in the car with 2 small children, about the social worker's ultimatum and the impossible choice between surrendering the girls or having them taken away. "I thought if I left them somewhere in the business district, someone successful would find them," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "Someone who could give them the life I couldn't. I was going to turn myself into the police after my mum's surgery, so at least they'd know I didn't just disappear on them." Richard felt his chest tighten as pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. "The surgery your mother needs. How much?" 25,000. But it doesn't matter now. The girls are more important than— What if I told you it doesn't have to be a choice?" Sarah looked up at him with eyes that had lost the ability to hope. "What do you mean?" Richard pulled out his phone and showed her a photo he'd taken that morning. Emma and Lily asleep on Catherine's daybed, peaceful and safe. "What if I told you that helping your family could help me too? That maybe we could find a solution that keeps everyone together?" "I don't understand." Richard stood up, extending his hand to help Sarah to her feet. "Come with me, come see your daughters, and then let's talk about what family really means." As they walked toward his car, Richard was already planning. He'd pay for Margaret's surgery, help Sarah get back on her feet, make sure the girls never had to be scared or hungry again. It seemed simple enough. He had the resources. They had the need. But what Richard didn't realize was that his offer of help would uncover a connection between their families that went back years, a connection that would challenge everything he thought he knew about fate, forgiveness, and the price of second chances. The elevator ride to Richard's penthouse felt like an eternity. Sarah stood frozen as the numbers climbed, her heart pounding so hard she was sure Richard could hear it. In a few moments, she would see Emma and Lily again, if they would even want to see her after what she'd done. "They've been asking about you," Richard said quietly as they reached the top floor. "Emma especially. She's been trying to be brave for Lily, but I can see she's scared you're not coming back." Sarah's composure, already hanging by a thread, snapped completely. "What if they hate me? What if they can't forgive me for leaving them?" "They're your daughters," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "They love you." "But Sarah, you need to know. I've called in some favors. Your mother's surgery is scheduled for this afternoon and it's been paid for." Sarah stopped walking, staring at him in shock. "What? How is that possible? I didn't ask you to." "You didn't need to ask. Sometimes help comes when we need it most, not when we think we deserve it." Richard's expression grew distant, and Sarah realized there was more to this story than simple charity. "My wife used to say that every act of kindness creates ripples we can't see. Maybe it's time I started believing her again." They reached the door, and Richard paused with his hand on the handle. "Before we go in, there's something you should know. I've been investigating your family's background, trying to understand the whole situation. Sarah, does the name Morrison mean anything to you?" Sarah frowned, searching her memory. "Morrison. There was a Morrison family that used to live in our neighborhood when I was little. They had a son who was friends with my older brother David before he died in that car accident, but that was 20 years ago." "Why?" Richard's face went pale. "What was your brother's name? His full name?" "David Chen. He was 16 when he died." "Why are you asking me this?" Richard leaned against the doorframe, looking like he'd seen a ghost. "Sarah, I think your brother saved my life." "What are you talking about?" 20 years ago, I was 18 and stupid and driving drunk after a party. I hit a tree on Aurora Avenue and my car caught fire. A teenager pulled me out and stayed with me until the paramedics came. He wouldn't give his name to the police, said he had to get home to his family. I never got to thank him." Sarah's world tilted on its axis. "The police report said David was coming home from work that night. He was always working, trying to help Mom with bills after Dad left. But he came home with burns on his hands and arms, said he'd helped someone in an accident. Mom was so angry at him for being reckless." "He saved my life," Richard whispered. "If he hadn't pulled me out of that car, I never would have met Catherine, never would have built my company, never would have been in the position to help you and the girls. Sarah, your brother's kindness 20 years ago is why I was able to find Emma and Lily. It's why I was able to help." Sarah felt her knees give out, and Richard caught her before she could fall. The impossible coincidence, the weight of everything that had happened, the revelation that David's final act of kindness was somehow connected to her daughter's rescue. It was too much to process. "The girls," she managed to whisper. "I need to see the girls." Richard nodded and opened the door. Inside, they could hear the sound of children's laughter for the first time in the penthouse in 3 years. Emma and Lily were awake, playing with some of Catherine's old books, their faces bright and rested. But the moment Emma saw Sarah, everything else disappeared. "Mama!" she cried, running across the room and throwing herself into Sarah's arms. "You came back! I told Lily you'd come back!" As Sarah held her daughters, breathing in the scent of their hair and feeling their warm bodies against hers, she realized that sometimes the darkest moments in life are just clearing the way for something beautiful to begin. But she had no idea that the connection between their families ran even deeper than Richard had discovered, and that the truth about David's death would change everything they thought they knew about fate, sacrifice, and second chances. The story was far from over. 3 hours later, Sarah sat in the waiting room of Seattle General Hospital while her mother underwent surgery. But for the first time in months, she wasn't alone. Richard had insisted on staying, and Emma and Lily were curled up in the chairs beside her, finally looking like the carefree children they should have been. "The surgeons said it could take 4 hours, Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady, but Dr. Patterson thinks they caught it in time." Richard nodded, watching Emma help Lily color in a book they'd bought from the gift shop. "Your daughters are remarkable, Sarah. The way Emma protected Lily at the bus stop, the way they've handled everything, they get that strength from you." "I don't feel strong," Sarah admitted. "I feel like I've failed at everything that matters. My marriage fell apart when the medical bills started piling up. I couldn't keep us housed. I abandoned my own children. You made an impossible choice in an impossible situation, Richard said firmly. But Sarah, there's something else we need to discuss. Something about David's accident that night. Sarah looked up from her coffee, sensing the gravity in his tone. What about it? Richard pulled out his phone and showed her a police report he'd obtained through his private investigator. I've been looking into the details of that night. Sarah, the accident report mentions that David wasn't alone in his car when he stopped to help me. Sarah's blood ran cold. What do you mean? There was a passenger. A girl, around 16. The report says she stayed in David's car while he pulled me from the wreckage. But here's what doesn't make sense. She was never interviewed, never identified. It's like she disappeared from the official record. Sarah's hands began to tremble. That's impossible. David was working that night. He was coming home from his job at the restaurant. Sarah, what if David wasn't coming home from work? What if he was running away? The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She looked at Emma and Lily, making sure they were out of earshot, then leaned closer to Richard. What are you suggesting? I think David was trying to leave Seattle that night, with someone. Maybe a girlfriend your family didn't approve of, maybe someone whose parents wouldn't let them be together. But when he saw my accident, he stopped to help, even though it meant risking whatever plan they had. Sarah felt the room spinning around her. You're saying my brother died because he stopped to save you? No, Richard said gently. I'm saying your brother chose to save me even when it cost him everything. According to the police timeline, if David had driven past my accident, he would have made it through the intersection before the drunk driver ran the red light. He died because he chose to be a hero. Sarah buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by the revelation. David hadn't just died in a random accident. He died because he'd chosen compassion over self-preservation, just like she'd chosen what she thought was best for Emma and Lily, even when it broke her heart. There's more, Richard said quietly. I think I know who was in the car with him. Before Sarah could respond, Dr. Patterson appeared in the waiting room doorway, his scrub still damp with sweat from the operating room. His expression was unreadable, and Sarah felt her heart stop. The surgery went well, he said, and Sarah felt the air rush back into her lungs. We removed all the visible cancer, and the margins look clean. Your mother is going to need chemotherapy and radiation, but her prognosis is good. Sarah started crying, deep, relieved sobs that came from somewhere in her soul. Emma and Lily immediately ran to her, wrapping their small arms around her neck. Can we see Grandma? Emma asked. Soon, sweetheart, Dr. Patterson said. She's in recovery now, but she'll be awake in an hour or two. As the doctor left, Richard turned back to Sarah. There's something your mother needs to know. About David, about what really happened that night. But Sarah, I think this conversation needs to happen when Margaret is stronger. What I've discovered, it's going to change everything your family believes about David's death. Sarah looked at her daughters, then at this man who'd appeared in their lives like an angel exactly when they needed him most. She thought about David, about the brother who'd always tried to protect everyone he loved, and realized that his final act of heroism had somehow led to her own family's salvation. But she had no idea that the girl in David's car that night was someone who would walk back into their lives within the week, bringing with her secrets that would challenge everything the Chen family thought they knew about love, loss, and the price of holding on to the past. Margaret Chen opened her eyes in the recovery room to find 3 faces she'd feared she might never see again: her daughter Sarah and her precious granddaughters Emma and Lily. For a moment, she thought she might be dreaming. "Grandma," Lily whispered, carefully climbing onto the bed beside her. "You're awake!" My beautiful girls," Margaret said, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube. "I was so worried about you. Where have you been staying?" Sarah, the apartment. It's okay, Mama, Sarah said quickly, taking her mother's hand. We found help. Someone very kind has been taking care of us. Margaret's eyes found Richard standing quietly in the corner of the room. Even groggy from anesthesia, she could see the expensive cut of his suit, the confident way he carried himself. And you are? Richard Morrison, Mrs. Chen. I'm honored to meet you. Something flickered in Margaret's eyes at the name. Morrison. That name sounds familiar. Sarah and Richard exchanged glances. They'd agreed to wait until Margaret was stronger before revealing the connection to David, but Margaret had always been sharp, even when medicated. We have a lot to talk about, Mama, Sarah said. But first, you need to rest and get better. The surgery went well? Margaret asked Dr. Patterson as he entered to check her vitals. Better than we hoped. You're going to need treatment, but you're going to be fine, Margaret. Your family needs you, and you're going to be here for them. As the doctor left, Margaret studied Richard with the keen eyes of someone who'd seen a lot of life. Mr. Morrison, you didn't just happen to find my family, did you? There's something you're not telling me. Richard looked at Sarah, who nodded slightly. Mrs. Chen, your son David saved my life 20 years ago. I never got the chance to thank him. Margaret's expression went very still. David died 20 years ago. Yes, Ma'am. He died because he stopped to help me when my car crashed. If he hadn't pulled me from that wreckage, I would have died. But his choice to save me. It meant he was still in the intersection when the other driver ran the red light. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pride. That sounds like my David. He never could walk past someone who needed help. Mama, Sarah said gently, there's more we need to tell you about that night, but maybe we should wait. No, Margaret said firmly, trying to sit up straighter. I've been carrying the weight of that night for 20 years, wondering if there was something I could have done differently, some way I could have prevented it. If there's more to know about my son's last hours, I want to hear it. Richard pulled out his phone and showed Margaret the police report. Mrs. Chen, David wasn't alone in his car that night. There was a girl with him, someone the police never identified. Margaret's face went white. A girl? We think David was running away that night, Sarah said gently. Maybe with someone you didn't approve of, or someone whose family didn't approve of him. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant with memory. There was a girl, she said finally. Rebecca Murphy. She was Irish, Catholic, and her father forbade her from seeing David because he was Asian. They'd been secretly dating for 2 years. What happened to her? Richard asked. After David died, she came to the funeral. Her father dragged her away before the service ended, and I never saw her again. I always wondered. Margaret's voice trailed off. Wondered what, Grandma? Emma asked, sensing the importance of the conversation even if she didn't understand it. Margaret looked at her granddaughter with eyes full of old pain. I wondered if she blamed me for David's death, if she thought our family somehow caused it. Her father certainly made it clear that he thought David was a bad influence on his daughter. Mrs. Chen, Richard said carefully, I have reason to believe Rebecca Murphy is still in Seattle, and I think it's time she learned the truth about what really happened that night. Margaret reached for Sarah's hand, squeezing it tightly. Find her, she said. Find her and tell her that David loved her. Tell her that his last act was one of heroism, not recklessness. Tell her that our family has never blamed her for what happened. What none of them knew was that Rebecca Murphy had been searching for the Chen family for 20 years, carrying her own burden of guilt and unanswered questions. And when Richard's private investigator found her, the reunion would reveal a secret that would change the lives of everyone in that hospital room. A secret that David had died protecting, and that Rebecca had been guarding ever since. Rebecca Murphy stood outside the Chen family's new apartment, the one Richard had quietly arranged and paid for, holding a bouquet of white lilies and a letter she'd written and rewritten 100 times over 20 years. At 46, she was still beautiful, with silver streaking her red hair and lines around her green eyes that spoke of years of laughter and tears. Sarah opened the door and immediately knew who she was, even though they'd never met. Rebecca had David's smile, or rather David had inherited her way of lighting up a room just by being present. "Rebecca!" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "You look just like him," Rebecca said, tears already flowing. "David always said you were going to be a heartbreaker when you grew up. He was so proud of his little sister." Sarah pulled her into a hug that was 20 years overdue. "Come in. Mama's been waiting to see you." Margaret was sitting in the living room with Emma and Lily, who were doing homework at the coffee table. When Rebecca walked in, time seemed to stop. "Mrs. Chen," Rebecca said, her voice breaking, "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I never came back after the funeral. I'm sorry I disappeared when you needed people around you." "I'm sorry." "Stop," Margaret said firmly, standing up and walking to Rebecca. "You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing. Do you understand me?" Rebecca shook her head, pulling out the letter she'd carried for 2 decades. "You don't understand. There's something I never told anyone about that night. Something David made me promise to keep secret." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "What kind of secret?" Rebecca looked at Emma and Lily, then at Margaret. "Maybe the girls should—" "No," Margaret said. "This family has had enough secrets. If it's about David, we all deserve to know." Rebecca sat down, her hands shaking as she unfolded the letter. "David and I weren't running away that night. We were coming back." "Coming back from where?" Sarah asked. "From the courthouse in Spokane. We'd gotten married that afternoon." The room fell silent except for the sound of Emma's crayon scraping against paper. Margaret sank back into her chair, staring at Rebecca in shock. "You were married?" Sarah whispered. 3 hours before the accident," Rebecca confirmed. "We'd been planning it for months. David wanted to wait until he turned 18 so we wouldn't need parental consent, but when my father threatened to send me to live with my aunt in Boston..." She wiped her eyes. "David said we'd elope, then come back and face whatever consequences there were together." Margaret's voice was barely audible. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because David made me promise that if anything happened to him, I wouldn't tell anyone about the marriage unless I was absolutely sure it wouldn't cause more pain for your family. He was terrified that you'd blame yourselves, that you'd think if you'd been more accepting of our relationship, he wouldn't have felt the need to elope." Richard, who had been quietly listening from the doorway, stepped forward. "Rebecca, there's something you need to know about that night, about why David stopped to help me." Rebecca looked up at him with eyes that held 2 decades of unresolved grief. "I've wondered every day why he got out of that car. We were so close to home, so close to starting our life together." "He stopped because that's who he was," Richard said gently. "But Rebecca, you were legally his wife when he died. You were entitled to his life insurance, to the settlement from the other driver's insurance company. That money could have changed everything for the Chen family." Sarah felt the room spinning. "What money?" Richard pulled out documents his lawyer had prepared. The drunk driver who killed David had substantial insurance. The settlement was $60,000, but it was paid to David's next of kin. Legally, that was Rebecca, not your family. Rebecca went pale. "I never knew. My father handled everything legal after David died, said the insurance companies were taking care of it. I never saw any money." "Because your father claimed you were mentally unstable from grief and had the settlement paid into a trust he controlled," Richard said grimly. "A trust that he's been using to pay for his own expenses for 20 years. The betrayal hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Not only had her father stolen her chance to help David's family in their time of need, but he'd used David's death to fund his own comfortable retirement. "That money was supposed to help you," Rebecca said to Margaret, her voice breaking. "David would have wanted it to go to his family. All these years you've been struggling, and I could have helped if I'd only known." Margaret stood up and walked to Rebecca, taking her hands in both of hers. "My dear girl, you were part of David's family. You were his wife. That makes you part of our family too." Emma looked up from her homework, confusion written across her 8-year-old face. "Does this mean Rebecca is our aunt?" "Yes, sweetheart," Margaret said, smiling through her tears. "Rebecca is your Aunt Rebecca." As the two women embraced, finally able to grieve David together after 20 years apart, none of them knew that Robert Murphy was on his way to Seattle, having learned that his long-buried secrets were about to be exposed. The final confrontation was about to begin. Robert Murphy arrived at Richard's office building the next morning like a man going to war. At 68, he was still imposing. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded rooms. But today, his usual confidence was cracking around the edges. "Mr. Morrison," he said, barging past Richard's assistant without invitation, "I understand you've been meddling in affairs that don't concern you." Richard looked up from his desk, studying the man who had stolen $60,000 from a grieving family. "Mr. Murphy, I was wondering when you'd show up. Where is my daughter?" "Rebecca is with her family, her real family, the one she should have been allowed to grieve with 20 years ago." Robert's face flushed red. "That girl was 17 years old and traumatized. I did what was best for her." "You mean you did what was best for your bank account?" Richard said, standing up. At 52, he was still in excellent shape, and he had no intention of being intimidated by this bully. $60,000, Robert. Money that belonged to David Chen's widow, your daughter. Rebecca was a child playing at being married. That ceremony meant nothing. It meant everything to David Chen, and it meant everything to Rebecca. Richard moved around his desk, his voice growing cold. "But you know what really bothers me about you, Robert? It's not even the money. It's the fact that you let the Chen family struggle for 20 years when you could have helped them. Those people meant nothing to me. Those people were your daughter's in-laws. David Chen was your son-in-law, whether you accepted it or not, and when he died, saving my life, you should have honored his sacrifice, not profited from it." Robert laughed bitterly. "Saving your life? Is that what you think happened? Boy, you don't know the whole story." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" "I mean, David Chen wasn't some hero. He was a reckless kid who got my daughter pregnant and was trying to run away from the consequences." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. Pregnant? 3 months along. Rebecca was 17 pregnant and married to a boy who worked in a restaurant kitchen. What kind of future was that going to be? Robert's voice turned vicious. "When I found out about the pregnancy and the secret marriage, I told David exactly what I thought of him, told him he'd ruined my daughter's life." Richard felt sick. "When did you tell him this?" "The night he died. I called him at work, told him I knew about Rebecca's condition, told him that if he truly loved her, he'd let her come home and we'd handle the situation properly. No need for a baby to ruin 2 young lives." The pieces clicked into place in Richard's mind with horrible clarity. David wasn't running away with Rebecca that night. He was bringing her home to you. Finally convinced him to do the right thing. Rebecca didn't know. She thought they were going to live with his family until David could afford their own place. But David knew better. He knew that girl needed to come home and let adults handle the situation. Richard felt rage building in his chest. What happened to the baby? Robert's expression turned cold and satisfied. There was no baby. The shock of David's death, the trauma. Rebecca lost the baby 2 days after the funeral. Problem solved itself. Richard saw red. In 2 quick steps, he was across the room, grabbing Robert by the shirt collar and slamming him against the wall. "You son of a bitch! You destroyed 3 lives that night." "Get your hands off me!" Robert snarled, but Richard could see fear in his eyes now. "David died thinking he was doing the right thing by bringing Rebecca home to you. Rebecca lost her husband, her baby, and 20 years with his family because you convinced her she was protecting them by staying away. And the Chen family struggled for decades with money that rightfully belonged to them." Richard's voice was deadly quiet. "You're going to fix this. I don't owe those people anything. You owe them everything. The settlement money, 20 years of interest, and a public apology for what you've done." Richard released Robert's shirt but stayed close, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because if you don't make this right, I'm going to use every resource I have to destroy you. I'll expose what you did to every newspaper in the city. I'll file criminal charges for theft and fraud, and I'll make sure that everyone knows how you profited from your son-in-law's heroic death." Robert straightened his shirt, trying to regain his composure. "You can't prove anything." Richard smiled coldly and pressed play on his phone's recording app. Robert's confession had been captured in its entirety. "Actually, I can prove everything. The question is, are you going to do the right thing for once in your miserable life, or am I going to have to force you?" Robert Murphy looked at Richard Morrison and realized he was facing a man who had the resources and determination to follow through on every threat. For the first time in his life, the consequences of his cruelty were about to catch up with him. The confrontation between Robert Murphy and his daughter took place in Margaret Chen's living room, with 3 generations of the Chen family watching a 20-year-old wound finally get the attention it deserved. Rebecca sat between Margaret and Sarah on the couch, holding Sarah's hand for strength, while Emma and Lily colored quietly in the corner, sensing the importance of the adult conversation. "Rebecca," Robert said, his voice carefully controlled, "you need to come home. This fantasy you're living with these people needs to end." "This isn't a fantasy, Dad. These are David's family, my family." Robert's composure cracked slightly. "David Chen was a mistake, a teenage infatuation that cost you everything." "David was my husband," Rebecca said firmly, "and he was going to be the father of my child." Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Child?" Rebecca turned to Margaret with tears in her eyes. "I was 3 months pregnant when David died. We were going to tell you that night after we explained about the marriage. David was so excited to give you your first grandchild." Sarah felt her world shift again. "I could have been an aunt 20 years ago." "What happened to the baby?" Margaret whispered. "I lost the baby 2 days after David's funeral," Rebecca said, her voice breaking. "The doctors said it was the stress and trauma. I've always wondered if our child would have had David's smile, his kind heart." Robert stood stiffly by the window, his back to the family. "The past is the past. Nothing can change what happened." "No," Richard said, entering the room with a thick folder of legal documents. "But we can change what happens next." He set the papers on the coffee table in front of Rebecca. "This is the settlement money from David's death, plus 20 years of accumulated interest. It comes to just over $200,000. Rebecca stared at the documents in shock. "I can't take this money. It should go to David's family." "You are David's family," Margaret said firmly. "You were his wife. According to law and according to love, that money is yours. But you needed it. All these years you've been struggling, and all these years you've been carrying guilt that wasn't yours to carry," Sarah interrupted. "Rebecca, David would want you to have this money. He would want you to build the life you two planned together." Robert finally turned around, his face red with anger. Rebecca, if you take that money, you're choosing them over your own father. You mean the father who stole from his own daughter? Richard asked coldly. The father who let David's family struggle for 20 years while he lived comfortably on money that didn't belong to him? Rebecca stood up, facing her father with strength she'd been building for 2 decades. Dad, I've spent 20 years believing I was somehow responsible for David's death, believing that loving him was a mistake that hurt his family. But I wasn't the one who hurt them. You were. Rebecca! I'm done, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I'm done letting you dictate my life. I'm done feeling guilty for loving David, and I'm done pretending that you had the right to steal from his family. Margaret stood up and put her arm around Rebecca. You have a choice to make, Robert. You can be part of this family's healing, or you can be the person who stands in the way of it. Robert looked around the room at the faces watching him. Margaret's quiet dignity, Sarah's protective anger, Richard's cold determination, and his daughter's newfound strength. For a moment, he seemed like he might apologize, might finally acknowledge the pain he'd caused. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and headed for the door. When this all falls apart, Rebecca, don't come running back to me. I won't need to, Rebecca called after him. I have a family now. After Robert left, the room fell silent for a moment. Then Lily looked up from her coloring book and asked the question that made everyone smile through their tears. Aunt Rebecca, are you going to stay with us forever now? Rebecca looked at Margaret, then at Sarah, then at the 2 little girls who had somehow become the bridge between past and present. If your family will have me, yes. I'm home. Richard watched the reunion with a heart that felt fuller than it had since Catherine's death. But he had no idea that the story was about to come full circle in a way that would honor both Catherine's memory and David's sacrifice, creating a legacy that would echo through generations. 6 months later, Richard stood in the garden of his new home, not the cold penthouse that had been a shrine to grief, but a warm, sprawling house with a swing set in the backyard and children's laughter echoing through the rooms. The memorial garden he'd planted for Catherine was in full bloom, and beside her stone marker was a new one for David Chen, beloved son, husband, and hero. Emma and Lily were playing with Rebecca's new daughter. Yes, at 46, Rebecca had discovered she was pregnant, a miracle that everyone agreed was David's final gift to his family. Little David, Margaret Murphy Chen, was only 3 months old, but he already had his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. He would have loved this, Margaret said, joining Richard by the memorial stones. At 69, she was cancer-free and stronger than she'd been in years, thanks to the treatment Richard's insurance had covered and the peace of mind that came with financial security. Both of them would have, Richard replied, thinking of Catherine. Your son saved my life so I could be here for this moment. And Catherine always said that love finds a way to complete itself, even across impossible odds. Sarah approached carrying a tray of lemonade, her nursing degree finally completed thanks to the scholarship fund Richard had established in David's name. Mom, Rebecca wants to know if you're ready to start the adoption paperwork. Margaret's eyes filled with happy tears. After 20 years of believing her bloodline would end with David's death, she was about to officially gain not only Rebecca as a daughter, but Emma and Lily as granddaughters through Sarah's relationship with Richard. Yes, Richard and Sarah had found love in the midst of their shared mission to heal their families. It had started slowly, conversations over homework help, shared meals while Margaret recovered, quiet moments when they'd both marveled at how 2 broken families had somehow made each other whole. Richard, Emma called from the swing set, are you going to be our dad now? Richard looked at Sarah, who smiled and nodded. They'd been planning to announce their engagement today, at the 1-year anniversary of the day he'd found the girls at the bus stop. Would you like me to be? He called back. Yes! Lily shouted. "And can we have a wedding with a big cake?" "The biggest cake in Seattle," Richard promised, pulling Sarah close. Rebecca emerged from the house carrying baby David, her face radiant with the happiness she'd thought she'd lost forever. "Did I miss the big announcement?" "You're just in time," Sarah said, holding up her left hand to show the engagement ring Richard had given her, not an expensive new one, but Catherine's ring, which Margaret had insisted Catherine would have wanted Sarah to wear. As the family gathered around to celebrate, Richard felt Catherine's presence in the garden, in the laughter of children, in the second chances that had bloomed from the seeds of tragedy. David Chen had saved Richard's life 20 years ago, and now Richard had been able to save David's family. The circle was complete. "You know," Margaret said, watching Emma push Lily on the swing while Rebecca nursed the baby on a nearby bench, "I used to think that losing David was the worst thing that could happen to our family. But maybe it was just the beginning of a different story, a bigger story." Richard nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives are just clearing the way for the best moments. Sometimes loss is just love preparing to multiply. As the sun set over their blended family, Richard Morrison, the lonely CEO who'd thought his heart died with his wife, realized that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just finds new ways to grow, new people to embrace, new generations to bless. The little girls who'd been abandoned at a bus stop had found their way home. The grieving mother who'd thought she'd lost everything had found love again. The widow who'd carried 20 years of secrets had found family. And the man who'd thought his heart was too broken to love again had discovered that some hearts are so big they can hold multiple lifetimes of love. In the end, that's what family really is. Not just the people who share your blood, but the people who choose to share your journey, your struggles and your triumphs. The people who see you at your worst and love you anyway. The people who prove day after day that no one has to face life alone. The Chen Morrison Murphy family had learned that lesson well, and they would spend the rest of their lives teaching it to Emma, Lily, and little David. 3 children who would grow up knowing that love is the strongest force in the universe, capable of healing any wound and bridging any gap. And somewhere in the stars above their celebration, David Chen and Catherine Morrison smiled down on the family their love had made possible.